We can talk about minimums and maximums here. Minimum amount of debt, the bankruptcy code really doesn't list a minimum amount of debt, but there's the practical issue. Let's say you have $2,000 worth of general unsecured debt, and that's your only debt. Well, the cost of doing the bankruptcy is going to be more than that. So on a practical level, it makes no sense to file with that little debt. On top of that, anytime you file a petition with the court, the Office of the United States Trustee will review that petition for various reasons, mostly to make sure that you're in the right chapter that you're in, that you aren't abusing the bankruptcy process by your filing. And one of the things that office will look at is this really an appropriate bankruptcy? And if you file with a very little amount of debt, the U.S. Trustee's office is going to say, no, this is a waste of time, because bankruptcy is sort of your financial nuclear weapon. And the courts don't want you wasting that weapon if you have a nominal amount of debt. As a result, I generally will not file a case unless the general unsecured debt's at least $20,000. Now, why $20,000? I guess I've chosen that somewhat arbitrarily, but I want to make sure that when I file a petition for someone, that I can give them the relief that they're looking for. And if the debt's too small, they may face a motion to dismiss the case. So that's dealing with the lowest amount of debt. Now, larger amounts of debt, well, that's a more complicated question. If you have a lot of unsecured debt, let's say a couple $100,000 worth of general unsecured debt on credit cards, and you file a Chapter 7, well, the folks at the U.S. Trustee's office and perhaps the Chapter 7 trustee appointed to the case are going to want to know, hey, what's going on here? How did you incur all that debt? And the Chapter 7 trustee will be interested in, because if you have all that debt, where'd the money go? Did you buy assets that you didn't disclose in your bankruptcy petition? If that's the case, well, that could lead to denial of discharge and even imprisonment. So you definitely want to list everything. If you have a good reason, and a simple example of a good reason is maybe you had a business that failed and you took out a lot of debt to try to get the business on track, but somehow the vicissitudes of the market made it impossible and you had to throw in the towel. That can be thought of as a legitimate reason for that kind of debt. Or you had some horrific medical catastrophe and you didn't have insurance. That's another good reason. But if you have a lot of unsecured debt, especially in a Chapter 7, that will prompt some probing by both the U.S. Trustee's office to see, has there been an abuse of the bankruptcy process, and by the Chapter 7 trustee appointed to the case. In Chapter 13, the Chapter 13 trustee is less likely to poke around on that, though if you don't have a lot of assets to show for all that debt, the Chapter 13 trustee may ask you to give an accounting of where the money went, because if you have a lot of assets, that can go into what's called the Chapter 7 liquidation analysis to determine how much you have to repay over the life of the Chapter 13 plan. In Chapter 11, things are a little bit different because there isn't a Chapter 11 trustee, and those plans tend to be dealing with fairly large amounts of debt. Why would a person, an individual, end up in a Chapter 11? Well, this gets to another issue with debt ceilings. Chapter 13, until very recently, had two debt ceilings, one for secured debts, the other for unsecured debts, with some qualifying language. But just in the last couple of weeks, a new statute was enacted that combined the debt into one number, both secured and unsecured, and pegged it at $2.75 million. So if your total debt load is less than that, you can be in a Chapter 13, provided you're an individual. Businesses cannot do Chapter 13. If you exceed that, well, then you'll have to do a Chapter 11. So do you have to have a certain amount of debt? Context is everything. Insufficient debt, don't bother with the bankruptcy. Too much debt to qualify for Chapter 13, probably looking at Chapter 11. And if you have a lot of debt, you may be asked to explain where all that debt came from.